Continuing Swift Rivers in Chapter 3, 3A. Chapter 3 is titled Gold in the Ashes. It would have been a matter of great surprise to Chris Dahlberg, chopping in lonely industry in the snowy woods, to hear that his venture was the subject of talk and wonder amongst his far-scattered valley neighbors. That community of settlers who had come from various Northland countries, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, or Germany, had thought at home that the differences in their various blood was very great. But they found after they had crossed the sea that there was no great diversity after all. They became a friendly, united neighborhood, some of them bolder and more enterprising than the others, a few of them of less easy disposition. There were none who could equal the dour selfishness of Nels Anderson. They became Americans quickly, for they had so much in common with the bold Anglo-Saxons who had been the first pioneers in the United States. They were seldom homesick, since this region of abundant lakes and swift-flowing rivers of white birch and dark pine was truly like home to them. The long winters meant nothing to a race who had known snow and cold for 3/4 of the year since time immemorial. They had brought some of their smaller customs with them. The women still wore yellow kerchiefs over their heads and gaily embroidered aprons for festival occasions. They worked in the fields as wholeheartedly as the men, and the entire adventure of seeding and harvest was of vital interest to every member of every household. They missed some of their old country festivals, brightened by garlands and processions and dancing on the grass, for which the toiling frontier life offered little occasion. A new venture by any member of the community was watched and commented upon with eager intensity. The experiment of cutting logs far away from a deep and navigable stream was a new and bold one, whose outcome might be very doubtful. Yet each farmer along Goosewing Valley had his own stretch of uncleared acres and was deeply concerned with the question of what Chris and Alexis Dahlberg would make out of this curious undertaking. Eric Knudsen believed in it, or at least Anna did, and Anna was the leading spirit on that small, struggling farmstead. Caspar Gottorp, of the blacksmith's forge at the turn of the valley, had his doubts, but Peter Brask was sure that the two were doing well. Caspar Gottorp was cannily glad to let the Dahlbergs have all the risk of the first venture, but he would be ready to put the axe to his own pine lands as soon as there was a hint that there was a profit in the experiment. All too ready he would be, for Caspar was of the sort who would cut his whole hillside bare with unforeseen thoroughness. Nels Anderson, the largest landowner, the most prosperous and the most looked up to man in the community, was the only one who was completely against it. A child's folly or an old man's, it does not matter much which it is, he told everyone. They are a pair who would be bound to find some way to ruin themselves. But at least they shall not ruin me. I am free of the responsibility of both of them. Only a week before the water began to run free, Caspar Gottorp came trudging up the hilly road to speak anxiously to Chris, cutting in the pine grove beyond grandfather's cabin. I have no business to tell you, he said distrustfully, crumbling his worn fur cap between nervous hands. But that uncle of yours, Nels Anderson, is preparing to do you real damage. He has kept me working for many days on a great iron chain, and though he does not say what it is for, I can make a guess. It is his idea to swing it across the river so that your logs cannot pass by. If he should ever know that I had spoken of this, it would be the ruin of all business between him and me. He gives me more work than does any other in the valley, for he has the biggest farms and keeps them up better than any other. But I had to tell you, Chris. He can't do it. He can't stop them, cried the boy in hot defiance. But after Caspar was gone, Chris Dahlberg's anger and resolution lost a little of their confidence. He had watched logs floating in a rapid current and knew with what force they came plunging against any obstacle, to roll over it or through it. But Nels Anderson was a clever and determined man. It was strange with what heavy weight the thought of another man's enmity would hang upon brave hopes of success. Chris said nothing to grandfather, but went about his work, wondering what should be done. The melting of the ice came suddenly. He had, as yet, seen no sign that Uncle Nels had dared to set any barrier in the way. On the morning that the logs first began to run, the whole countryside turned out to watch them pass. When they caught against the banks or hung swaying on the rocky rapids, there was no lack of volunteers to push them off. It was like some gay carnival, that early progress of the long procession downstream. There was laughter and shouting all along the upper miles of the river, slipping and splashing as the untried helpers strove too zealously to assist the logs to go onward. Tumultuous cheering when a small jam broke and let the dark rolling trunks shoot downstream once more. The biggest log of all, and the one most reluctant to travel in the shallow, swift waters, was the first section of the tremendous walnut tree. Through all the long journey, Chris was to find that great log the center of the most of the difficulty. On all the rapids, it was the one most prone to go aground. In the high-piled jams, it was apt to be the foundation of the trouble. But it was the one which set out first in slow, stately progress down the clear run of the channel. Some laughing girl from one of the farms had thrown a garland of pine boughs and spring flowers to bring good luck to the great enterprise. By chance, the wreath had caught upon the vast brown surface and clung there through all the first day of travel, sparkling with water drops, green and gay in the midst of hurrying tumult of black, jostling trunks, and white water. The first day's run made no great progress, for the river was not yet so high as it would be later. Then, with a sudden snap of biting cold, the winter shut down once more. The head of the trail of traveling logs had reached the pool below Caspar Goddard's place, but there the water skimmed over so suddenly with newly forming ice that progress was halted. The next day and the next were colder yet. The ice thickened inch by inch, and the whole journey came to a complete standstill. Although Chris had waited the whole of winter for the logs to begin to move, it seemed now that the delay of a single hour would destroy him. He walked some way down the river to look for open water and ended up sleeping in Peter Brask's slough. He got up in the night a dozen times and stole out to observe the wind and the stars and the condition of the stubborn ice. There was snow on the third night of waiting, snow which wrapped everything in the soft, wet mantle that late snow brings, instead of the hard, icy powder of the midwinter drifts. Chris, restlessly abroad at midnight, went to make the 20th inspection of the hard surface of the river and felt that he could not return to bed and sleep. For the first time, he walked down the narrow path which skirted the bank and led to the farm of Uncle Nels. As he came close to a turn in the stream at the edge of the Anderson land, he heard subdued voices and a clinking of iron which, in spite of any effort for silence, sounded clear in the stillness of the night. The boy came softly through the snow, past a growth of willow, and stood still to watch what was going forward.
Lanterns were moving here and there, and not far away one of them had been set down upon a rock to light the work at the edge of the ice. Chris could make out the burly form of Uncle Nels and could hear his gruff voice giving orders. Two of the farm laborers were bracing a deep-set post and, on account of the frozen ground and the impatience of their supervisor, were making a nervous and clumsy task of it. "Can't you make haste?" Chris heard Nels Anderson growl, shifting his feet in the wet snow. "The chain is made fast on the other side of the stream, and you should have got this in steady long ago. Put those two big stones against the post. It will have to stand plenty of strain." He shuffled restlessly again and burst out in desperate impatience. "Don't you know that the logs might come down at almost any time now?" It was Chris Dahlberg's impulse to jump down the bank, to strike against the three, to seize the big sledge that they were using and swing it furiously against the post until the chain was smashed free. But the weight of a great responsibility laid a steadying hand upon him. To do violence to Uncle Nels would not further his journey in any way. It might even put an end to it before it had well begun. He stood, raging and wondering what he should do, while below him the work was carried on with difficulty and hard words. At last one of the laborers straightened up with a grunt and said, "There, sir, she's steady. I've done my best to do as you ordered, but I don't like it, Nels Anderson. We, none of us, like it." What answer Nels growled was not audible, for he picked up the heavy mallet and struck it against the post. "It's firm enough," he said more clearly. "Now drive the last staple home." The clanging of hammer on iron echoed loud through the night. When Nels Anderson was finally satisfied, he buttoned up his heavy coat and said gruffly, "Now you two are to bide here and keep watch. You can build a fire if you must, but mind it is a small one and under cover of the bank where no one will see. We have taken so much trouble that we must make certain now that our work will stand safe." He strode away along the bank, which was low just here, where an elbow of the stream skirted his most fertile meadow. The water ran close to a range of sheds where he stored hay and fed his sheep, when the barns above had room for no more. Chris watched him disappear, but knew that the pair below could call him back with all the other farm helpers at the first hint of an alarm. He must wait, the boy decided. He must wait until next morning. The cold would surely hold through it another day. In that time, he would gather some of his friends and well-wishers, the younger men who had the most vivid interest in what he was trying to accomplish. They would come, a dozen strong, to the waterside. If they must use violence, then they must. Nels Anderson was not to stand in the way of what he and grandfather had set out to do. He was sure some of the men of the valley would help him. He was sure. So he told himself as he trudged back in the dark to Peter Brask's loft. He knew in his heart that Nels Anderson was a man of power in that small community. His belief that he could find men to stand against him was a cold, cheerless hope, very near to frozen despair. He crept into the hay of his bed and was so weary that, almost at once, he fell deeply asleep. The wind lifted and came booming up the valley from the south, but he did not hear it. He was aroused near morning by noise below, by the sound of running feet and the thump of a horse's hoofs as it was backed hastily from its stall. People were calling to one another in a confusion of alarm. The soft pat of the snowfall had given place to the drumming of a steady rain. Chris plunged down the ladder to ask what was happening. Trouble at the Andersons. A fellow came galloping along the road, raising a shout for help. Back, back, will you? Heisel, step into the shafts like a good creature. Peter Brask bent to fasten straps and buckles in the lantern light. Chris did not wait to help him, but ran, pulling on his coat as he went, down the willow-grown path by the river. The roar of angry waters which sounded in his ears began presently to give him some inkling of what Nels Anderson had brought to pass. The ice, broken into great pieces by the warmth of the rain, had come drifting down from above upon the barrier, had caught on the chain and held, piling up in a great gorge and damming the stream. Water was spurting out on each side and flowing in shallow reaches all across the low meadow. Eric saw a little shed lift, lurch, and go floating away, bobbing like a cork in the heaving waters. Nels Anderson's men were running back and forth, shouting confused directions and saving what they could. Chris could hear a big ram stamping and snorting in protest as he was hurried up the bank, and the terrified bleating of a yearling sheep which had got separated from its fellows. As he stood still for a moment, wondering where he would do best to lend a hand, he heard a voice call desperately, "Chris! Chris!" It was Freda Anderson, dripping wet, her skirts snapping in the wind. She was standing on a great stone at the very brink of the river with the water pouring over her feet. "Come quickly to help my father," she shouted above the noise of the rain. "The others do not dare to come near." He ran to her, splashing through the flood, and saw that the stopping of the stream had laid the riverbed almost bare, and that his Uncle Nels was down there among the rocks. He was striking at the wedged ice cakes with a pickaxe in a wild effort to make an opening for the water to come through. Chris jumped down beside him, took the heavy pick from his exhausted hands, and swung it above his head for a smashing blow at the rotten ice. At that instant he heard Freda cry out again, "Look! Look, the logs are coming!" The boy's mind seemed to move far more quickly than even his own conscious purpose could follow. Without even looking up, he caught Nels Anderson under the arms and dragged him bodily to the bank and up its muddy slope. The water was swirling about their waists before they reached Freda's side. Chris had a quick vision of the great dark shapes of the logs, set free suddenly from the ice above and riding down the flood in headlong phalanx. He heard a sharp report, half crack, half ring of metal. It was the chain, snapping like a thread under the onslaught and whipping back to cut through the branches of a tree close overhead. The ice loosened and crashed downward with a deafening roar, while more and more logs came rocketing over the crumbling barrier. The flood water about the feet of the three began to subside as the river poured back into its natural channel. Chris saw the big walnut log turn over and over at the crest of the gorge and then go shooting down into the deepening pool below. It was like some giant bellwether of a flock of sheep. Where it could go, the others would surely follow. He turned down the riverbank to set out in pursuit. "Chris," Freda called, protesting, "you shall not go like this when you are half drowned. You must come to the house to get warm and dry." He glanced back at her from where he stood on the bank below. Nels Anderson was staring at him, dully, as though still too stupefied to speak. Beyond, Chris could see the little shed which had been afloat, settling down crookedly upon a rock. its sides cracked like those of a paper box, while the hay within came bursting out at all corners. He looked at the river and saw the logs moving steadily now, a well-ordered army marching deliberately forward. He lifted his hand in goodbye to Freda and called through the sheets of rain which were blowing between them, "Tell Eric Knudsen to follow. I must go on." Before he had advanced more than a few hundred feet farther, the veil of rain had hidden not only Freda and her father, but that hollow in the hills where lay the Anderson farm and the home he had known for all his life.